My name is Heidi Green. I am 32 years old, and the captain's uniform I'm wearing today isn't for a parade. It is for combat in a place I never expected to be. Family court. My father, the wealthy man sitting on the other side of the aisle in a shiny Italian suit, just turned to his young mistress and smirked when he saw my mother sitting curled up alone, without a lawyer. He thinks his money has finally crushed her. But that smile vanished the exact moment the heel of my military boot struck the hardwood floor with a sharp, steel-like clack. I stood at attention, looked the judge dead in the eye, and declared clearly, "Your Honor, I, Captain Heidi Green, will be representing her." My father calls me a useless tin soldier because I don't know how to make money like he does. But he forgot one thing. The Army taught me how to hunt down enemies, and the file I am gripping in my hand right now contains secrets he thought were buried forever. Please comment justice and subscribe to the channel if you believe that no hard-working mother deserves to be betrayed. Here's how I taught my father a lesson about honor. The parking lot of the county court in Ohio was gray and freezing this morning, perfectly matching the color of my mother's mood. She sat huddled inside her 2010 Ford Taurus, the engine idling roughly. Her thin hands were clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had turned completely white. Mom was wearing a brown wool coat that was fraying at the shoulders, a coat I remember her buying on clearance at Walmart 5 years ago. She stared out the foggy window, watching as a sleek black Porsche Cayenne pulled into the reserved spot across the lot. My father stepped out, looking like $1 million. "Heidi," Mom's voice trembled, barely a whisper. "He has an entire team of lawyers. He told me he would crush me into dust if I dared to ask for a division of assets. Maybe we should just go home, honey. I don't need the money. I just want peace. I just want to be left alone." I reached over and took her freezing hand in mine. Her skin felt rough against my palm, covered in calluses, the physical receipts of 30 years of hard labor she spent building my father's career. My chest tightened with a mix of sorrow and rage, but I knew I wasn't allowed to be weak right now. "We aren't going anywhere, Mom," I said softly but firmly. We walked into the courthouse lobby. The smell hit me instantly, that specific mix of old oak wood, floor wax, and stale coffee that fills every government building in the Midwest. Across the hallway, my father, Robert Bob Green, was standing there, laughing loudly. He was wearing a custom-tailored Armani suit that probably cost more than my mother's car. Next to him was Tiffany. She's only 26, just a few years older than me. She was glued to her iPhone, scrolling through Instagram and chewing gum with her mouth open, looking bored. She represented everything my mother wasn't: flashy, expensive, and hollow. When Bob saw us approaching, the laughter died in his throat. The smile was replaced by that familiar, arrogant sneer. He didn't look at me. He looked straight at Mom with the eyes of a predator spotting a wounded animal. He raised his voice intentionally, making sure his entourage and everyone in the lobby could hear. "Well, look at that. Who did Martha bring along? Does her little tin soldier plan to use a plastic gun to scare the judge?" His lawyer and Tiffany burst into laughter. The sound echoed off the high ceilings like sharp knives, designed to stab right into my mother's self-esteem. Mom shrank into her coat, trying to disappear. I kept my face frozen, a stone mask. It's a skill I didn't learn in law school. I learned it through thousands of hours of interrogation training. You never let the enemy see you bleed. I guided Mom to the defendant's table and helped her sit down. My father walked past us to get to the plaintiff's side. The smell of his expensive cologne was so overpowering it was nauseating. He paused right behind my chair and leaned down, his lips close to my ear. He whispered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Heidi, wake up. This is the real world, not your little army barracks. In here, money talks. Honor? That's just garbage for losers. You'd better tell your mother to sign the waiver and get lost. If she's good, I might toss her a few bucks to survive the winter." He pulled back with a smug grin and sat down. Beside me, Mom's head was bowed low. Tears began to drop silently onto her battered handbag. The anger rose in my throat, hot and burning like acid. He wasn't just betraying her, He was actively trying to strip away the last shred of her dignity. He wanted her broken. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice boomed through the room. Judge Harrison entered. He was an older man, stern, with silver hair and a no-nonsense attitude. He took the bench, adjusted his glasses, and opened the case file. He frowned, looking down at the paperwork. "Defendant Martha Green," the judge said, looking over his spectacles. "I do not see a record of legal representation in your file. Do you intend to represent yourself today?" From the other table, I heard a stifled giggle. My father and Tiffany were leaning in, eager to watch the show. They were waiting for the moment my mother would stutter, collapse, and surrender. But that moment never came. I stood up. I didn't just stand. I snapped to attention. My military-issue dress shoes struck the heels together, creating a singular, sharp clack that cut through the murmuring of the courtroom. The sound was distinct, disciplined, and dangerous. I adjusted the rack of ribbons and medals on the left side of my chest. I stood with a posture that was forged in boot camp and refined in war zones. I looked straight into Judge Harrison's eyes, projecting my voice with the commanding authority of a commanding officer. "Your Honor," my voice rang out, clear and steady. "I, Captain Heidi Green, of the United States Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, will be representing her." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. I glanced to my left. The smile on my father's face had completely vanished. For the first time all morning, the predator looked unsure. He thought he was fighting a helpless old woman. He had no idea he had just declared war on the United States Army. As Judge Harrison quietly reviewed the power of attorney documents I had just slapped onto his bench, the courtroom fell into a heavy, suspended silence. I didn't look at the judge. I didn't look at my father. My eyes were locked on the table in front of us, specifically on my mother's hands. They were resting on the polished oak surface, shaking uncontrollably. Those hands were rough, the skin paper-thin and spotted with age, the knuckles swollen from arthritis. They were the hands of a woman who had worked herself to the bone. Looking at them, the smell of floor wax and old wood in the courtroom seemed to fade away. Suddenly, I was transported back in time. I was back in our cramped, humid kitchen in the mid-90s. The air was thick, smelling of onions and stale fryer grease. That was the smell of my childhood. Back then, my father had just started Green Construction. He was nothing more than a guy with a pickup truck and a dream, drowning in debt. To keep the lights on, Mom worked double shifts at the local Denny's diner. She was on her feet for 12 hours a day, serving pancakes and refilling coffee for truckers, only to come home with her ankles swollen to the size of softballs. I remember the dinners from those days vividly. It was almost always the same thing: Kraft mac and cheese, the cheap kind from the blue box that cost 99 cents. Mom would stand at the stove, still in her stained polyester waitress uniform, scraping the bottom of the pot. She always served my father first, a heaping pile of pasta. Then she served me. When she finally sat down, her plate contained nothing but the burnt, crunchy scraps that had stuck to the metal pan. "I'm full, sweetie," she would say with a tired, gentle smile when she caught me staring at her meager portion. "I ate a big lunch at the diner. Your father needs the energy. He's building something big for us." She was lying. I knew it even then. She wasn't full. She was starving. She was feeding his ambition with her own sustenance. She was pouring her life force into him, believing that they were a team, that his success would eventually be her success. But as the years went by, the success did come, and everything changed. Green Construction started landing lucrative subcontracts. The rusty pickup truck was traded in for a brand new showroom model. The bills disappeared, replaced by a surplus of cash. But instead of relief, a new kind of tension entered our home. Dad started traveling more. Business trips, he called them. He would be gone for days, then weeks. When he was home, he was critical. He stopped looking at Mom with gratitude and started looking at her with disgust. I remember one evening vividly. Dad was getting dressed for a Chamber of Commerce dinner. He looked sharp in a new suit. Mom came out of the bedroom wearing her best dress, a floral print she had bought at a department store sale. She looked beautiful to me. Dad just sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion and annoyance. Martha, look at you, he grumbled, adjusting his tie in the mirror without making eye contact. You look tired. Look at the other wives, my partner's wives. They smell like expensive perfume. They look polished. You always have that smell, like grease and dish soap. Honestly, it's embarrassing. You're making me look bad. He didn't hit her. He didn't have to. Words like that leave bruises that never heal. I watched Mom shrink into herself. That night, she didn't argue. She just went into the bathroom and locked the door. I sat outside in the hallway and listened to the water running. She was in the shower for an hour. She scrubbed her skin raw, turning it red and irritated, desperately trying to wash away the smell of labor that her husband had once been so thankful for. She didn't understand that he didn't hate the smell of grease. He hated the reminder of where he came from. She was a living artifact of his poverty, and he wanted to erase her. The ultimate betrayal, however, didn't happen in the kitchen or the bathroom. It happened on Christmas Eve. I was 18 years old, fresh out of Army boot camp. I had just come home on leave, exhausted but excited to sleep in my own bed and eat a real family meal. I walked through the front door expecting the smell of roast turkey and the sound of Christmas carols. Instead, I was greeted by the sound of my mother sobbing in the master bedroom. I ran upstairs, my heart pounding. Mom was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a stack of papers. Dad was packing a suitcase. He looked calm, almost bored, like he was checking off a grocery list. We just aren't compatible anymore, Martha, he said, zipping up his leather bag. I've outgrown this life. I need someone who can stand beside me at galas, someone who fits the image of the company I've built. He didn't just leave. He handed her a divorce settlement he had drawn up himself, bypassing lawyers to save money. Sign this, he told her, his voice dropping to that manipulative, reassuring tone he was so good at. It's a fair deal. I'll send you a monthly check. I'll take care of you, Martha. You know I will. Don't get the courts involved. They'll just take all the money and fees. And my mother, the woman who had spent 32 years trusting this man implicitly, the woman who ate the burnt scraps so he could be full, she signed it. She believed him. Flash forward to today. I blinked, bringing myself back to the cold reality of the courtroom. The smell of frying grease was gone, replaced by the sterile scent of the law. I looked across the aisle. Tiffany was whispering something into my father's ear. She giggled, and her hand came up to cover her mouth. On her finger sat a diamond ring the size of a grape. I did the math in my head instantly. That ring cost at least $50,000. That was more than the value of the entire apartment my mother was currently renting. That ring was bought with the money my mother saved by clipping coupons. It was paid for by the double shifts at Denny's. It was polished with the sweat of a woman who was now being discarded like an old piece of furniture. It is a phenomenon sociologists call starter wife syndrome. The woman supports the man through the struggle, builds him up, and manages the home so he can focus on his career. Then, once he reaches the summit of the mountain she helped him climb, he pushes her off the edge and pulls up a younger, fresher woman to enjoy the view. Dad looked over at us again. He saw me staring at Tiffany's ring. He smirked and put his arm around her waist, a protective and possessive gesture he hadn't used with Mom in 20 years. If you are listening to this and you believe that a woman's sacrifice should be honored, not thrown in the trash, please hit that like button right now. Leave a comment saying, Team Mom if you stand with Martha. Let's show the world that loyalty still matters. My father whispered something to Tiffany, and they both looked at Mom with pity. Not empathy, pity. They thought she was pathetic. But they were wrong. I looked back down at my mother's hands. They were still shaking, yes. But they were the hands that had held me when I cried. They were the hands that had scrubbed floors and carried heavy trays. They were strong hands. My father had used the money, our family's money, to hire a shark of a lawyer to fight the woman who made him. He thought this was a game. He thought he could buy his way out of his past. He forgot that the little girl who watched her mother starve so he could eat had grown up. I wasn't just here to defend her. I was here to balance the scales. I wasn't asking for charity. I was here to collect a debt that was 32 years overdue. The courtroom recess was announced, and the heavy oak doors swung open. I watched my father strut out into the hallway, flanked by his legal team like a general leading a parade. He didn't look back at me. To him, I was invisible. Or worse, I was an embarrassment. My father, Robert Bob Greene, had always wanted a son. He needed a Robert Jr. to inherit the hard hat, the steel-toed boots, and the eventual empire of green construction. He wanted a clone. Instead, he got me. When I was born a girl, his disappointment was quiet but palpable. But when I grew up and decided I didn't want to study business administration, when I told him I wanted to study law and join the army, that disappointment turned into open contempt. I remember the day I received my acceptance letter to law school. I was 22, beaming with pride, holding the envelope in the kitchen. He didn't even put down his newspaper. "I'm not paying a single red cent for that," he had declared, his voice flat and final. "Lawyers are parasites, Heidi. And the army? That's for people who aren't smart enough to make it in the real business world. You want to be a little tin soldier? Fine, go play dress up. But you're on your own. Don't come crawling back to me when you realize you can't pay the rent." So, I didn't. I joined the ROTC program to pay for my education. While the children of his wealthy business partners, the smart ones, were driving BMWs bought with daddy's money and partying at fraternities, I was up at 4 a.m. I was low-crawling through freezing mud pits in the pouring rain. I was eating MREs that tasted like cardboard while they were dining on sushi. I pushed my body until my muscles screamed. I studied until my eyes blurred. I never asked him for a dime. Not for books, not for rent, not for food. I thought that maybe, just maybe, if I succeeded on my own terms, he would respect me. I was wrong. Every time I came home in my uniform, expecting a nod of approval, I only saw a sneer. He looked at the flag patch on my shoulder and saw a minimum wage worker. He looked at my combat boots and saw failure. I walked out into the courthouse hallway, shaking off the memory. The air conditioning was humming loudly, mixing with the low murmur of lawyers negotiating deals in corners. I walked over to the vending machine in the alcove. I fished out a few quarters and pressed the button for black coffee. The machine whirred and spat out a paper cup filled with dark, bitter liquid. I took a sip. It tasted burnt and watery, but the caffeine hit my system with familiar efficiency. It reminded me of the coffee at the JAG school in Charlottesville, Virginia. That place didn't just teach me the uniform code of military justice. It taught me survival. My father thinks the law is a series of loopholes designed to protect his profit margins. He thinks a contract is just a suggestion. But at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center, I learned that the law is the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. I learned to keep my head cool when the world was literally exploding around me. I spent a tour in Afghanistan, drafting legal briefs while mortar sirens wailed in the distance. I learned that in war, and in law, a single overlooked detail, a missing signature, a wrong timestamp, a forgotten clause, can cost lives, or save them. My father calls me rigid. He calls me robotic. He doesn't understand that my discipline isn't a flaw, it is armor. And right now, he was about to test that armor. Enjoying that swill? I turned. Bob Greene was standing there, leaning against the wall with casual arrogance. In his hand, he held a venti Starbucks latte, the whipped cream still perfectly swirled on top. The smell of expensive vanilla and roasted espresso wafted off him, clashing with the stale air of the hallway. He took a slow sip, watching me over the rim of the cup. "You know," he started, that fake friendly smile plastering his face. "I heard what a captain makes these days. It's embarrassing, Heidi, really. It's barely enough to buy a decent suit, let alone a life. Look at you. No makeup, hair in a tight bun. You look so severe." I didn't blink. I just held my paper cup, letting the heat seep into my cold fingers. "I earn every dollar I make, Bob. Can you say the same?" He laughed, a short, dismissive bark. Always so self-righteous. "Look, I'm feeling generous today. I know you're going to lose in there. You're out of your depth. This isn't a court-martial. This is the real world. So, here's an offer. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. He lowered his voice, trying to sound benevolent. When this is over and your mother is out of the picture, come work for me. I need a new executive secretary. You're organized, I'll give you that. The pay is double what Uncle Sam gives you. You could finally afford to buy some lipstick, maybe get a makeover, start looking like a woman instead of a whatever this is. He gestured vaguely at my uniform, his face twisted in distaste. The insult landed with precision. He wasn't just attacking my career, he was attacking my identity. He was telling me that my value lay solely in my appearance and my subservience to men like him. He thought he could buy my dignity with a salary bump and a tube of lipstick. He thought that, deep down, I was just a broke girl desperate for his validation. He expected me to get angry. He expected me to shout, to cause a scene in the hallway so his lawyer could use it against me. She's unstable, Your Honor. She has anger issues, but he forgot where I came from. The army breaks you down to build you back up with steel. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my bitter vending machine coffee. I let the silence stretch for 5 seconds. A tactical pause designed to make him uncomfortable. I looked him up and down, analyzing him not as a father, but as a hostile target. I saw the sweat beading on his forehead despite the AC. I saw the twitch in his left eye. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Green," I said. My voice was low, calm, and terrifyingly polite. I used his last name. I saw him flinch. But the United States Army pays me enough to understand a very simple concept. Honor is not something you can purchase with a platinum credit card. You think this is about money. You think you can buy me, just like you bought your car, your suits, and your mistress. I took a step forward. He instinctively took a step back, his back hitting the wall. "You should be less worried about my lipstick and more worried about your CEO chair," I whispered, my eyes locking onto his. "Because you made a mistake, Bob. You judged me by your standards. You thought I was weak because I don't worship money. But when I am done with you in that courtroom, you are going to wish you had never woken up this tin soldier." I didn't wait for his response. I finished my coffee in one gulp and crushed the paper cup in my hand. I walked over to the trash can next to him. I dropped the crushed cup inside with a definitive thud. It was a small gesture, but it felt like dropping a gavel. "I'll see you inside," I said, not looking back. I turned on my heel and marched away, the sound of my boots echoing down the long corridor. I left him standing there, holding his overpriced latte, looking confused and, for the first time, genuinely rattled. He thought the war was over because he had the bigger bank account. He didn't realize that the real battle had just begun. And unlike him, I didn't come here to negotiate a deal. I came here to execute a mission. That night, the war didn't take place in a trench or a courtroom. It took place in the cramped dining nook of my mother's rented apartment. While Mom slept fitfully in the other room, I transformed her small, wobbly dining table into a command post. I pushed aside the lace doilies and the bowl of fake fruit. In their place, I laid out my laptop, a stack of highlighters, and 3 cardboard boxes of garbage that Mom had managed to save from the house before she was kicked out. My father had laughed at these boxes. He told his lawyers they were just old receipts, expired warranties, and junk mail. He thought they were trash. But in the intelligence community, we have a saying: one man's trash is another man's conviction. I taped a large sheet of butcher paper to the wall. On it, I drew a timeline of the marriage, marked with black Sharpie. I was no longer just a daughter or a lawyer. I had switched modes. I was an intelligence officer conducting a forensic audit. The room was silent except for the humming of the refrigerator and the scratching of my pen. I didn't read the documents like a civilian. I wasn't looking for the story. I was scanning for anomalies. I was looking for the break in the pattern. Hour after hour, I sifted through the debris of 30 years. Utility bills, credit card statements from 1998, grocery receipts. It was tedious, mind-numbing work. It was the kind of work that makes civilian lawyers give up and settle. But I had spent 12-hour shifts scanning satellite imagery looking for disturbed dirt on a roadside in Kandahar. I had patience. By 03 a.m., my eyes felt like they were filled with sand. The caffeine from earlier had worn off, replaced by a dull headache. But my brain was vibrating with alertness. I picked up an old issue of Field and Stream magazine from the bottom of the second box. It was dated 5 years ago. My father didn't hunt, and he didn't fish. Why did he have this? I shook the magazine. A single small slip of paper fluttered out and landed on the linoleum floor. It was a carbon copy of a FedEx waybill. The paper was yellowed and fading, the ink barely legible. I squinted under the dim kitchen light. Sender, Robert Greene. Recipient, Blue Ocean Holdings, Limited. Location, Georgetown, Cayman Islands. My heart skipped a beat. A construction company in rural Ohio had absolutely no business sending urgent documents to a tax haven in the Caribbean. I rushed to the timeline on the wall. I checked the date on the FedEx receipt against my father's business travel calendar. May the 14th. On the calendar, it was marked as SE Region Builders Conference, Miami. I checked the next year. Another trip to Miami. Another FedEx receipt found in a stack of old bank statements, this time for a P.O. box in the Caymans. The pattern emerged from the chaos like a flare in the night sky. Miami wasn't the destination. Miami was the gateway. He was flying to Florida ostensibly for work, but he was using it as a jump-off point to move assets offshore. He was funneling money out of the country right under Mom's nose. I didn't sleep. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky a bruised purple, I opened my laptop. This was where being a federal officer gave me an advantage that Bob's expensive strip mall lawyers didn't anticipate. They were playing by local civil court rules. I was playing by federal rules. I drafted a federal subpoena. I didn't target the Cayman accounts directly. That would take months of international treaties and red tape. Instead, I targeted the intermediary bank in Miami that was listed on the wire transfer codes I found on the back of the FedEx slip. My father's lawyers were lazy. They were arrogant. They assumed my mother was just a country bumpkin who wouldn't know the difference between a 401k and a routing number. They hadn't scrubbed the metadata. They hadn't shredded the paper trail because they didn't respect their opponent. I attached my credentials to the digital subpoena. Captain, JAG Corps. This wasn't a request. It was a demand backed by the full weight of the United States government. When I clicked send, I felt a physical jolt of electricity run down my spine. It wasn't just satisfaction. It was the distinct, cold thrill of locking a target into a weapon system. This wasn't a warning shot. This was the coordinates for a precision airstrike. I waited. 2 days later, the encrypted file arrived in my inbox. I sat at the same kitchen table, Mom sitting across from me drinking herbal tea. She looked frail, her eyes swollen from crying. "Did you find anything, Heidi?" she asked softly. "Maybe we should just take the settlement offer. He said he'd give me $20,000. "Don't take the settlement, Mom," I said, my eyes glued to the screen. The PDF opened. As I scrolled through the transaction history, the blood drained from my face. It was worse than I thought. It wasn't just greed. It was cruelty. First, there was the tax evasion. That was expected. Millions of dollars funneled into shell companies registered to Tiffany Miller, his mistress. He was stripping the company of its assets so that on paper, Green Construction looked broke. Then, there was the 401k. The retirement fund that Mom and Dad had contributed to for 30 years, the money meant for their old age, had been drained. He had forged her signature on a withdrawal form 3 years ago, claiming financial hardship, and moved the cash into a private trust. But the final document, that was the one that made me physically nauseous. I found a credit report. Not my father's, my mother's. In the United States, your FICO score is your lifeline. Without a good credit score, you cannot rent an apartment, you cannot buy a car, you cannot get a loan. You are paralyzed. My father had used my mother's social security number, without her knowledge, to open 5 distinct high-interest credit cards. He had maxed them out on gambling debts and luxury gifts for Tiffany. And then, he stopped paying. He had deliberately defaulted on debt in her name. My mother's credit score was in the low 400s. It was destroyed. He hadn't just stolen the money. He had salted the earth. He had engineered a situation where, Even if Mom left him, she would be financial poison. No landlord would rent to her. No bank would touch her. He wanted to make sure that she had no choice but to crawl back to him or live on the street. This was financial domestic violence. It was calculated, systematic, and evil. I looked up from the screen. Mom was watching me, fear trembling in her lip. "Is it bad?" she whispered. I closed the laptop slowly. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. I looked at the knuckles of my hand, white from gripping the edge of the table. "It's not bad, Mom," I said, my voice eerily calm. "It's criminal." I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, people were going about their day, mowing lawns and walking dogs, completely unaware of the monster living in the big house on the hill. Bob Green wanted to play dirty? He wanted to use paper and ink to destroy a life? Fine. He wants a war, I said to the reflection in the glass. I'm going to give him total annihilation. I picked up my phone. I dialed the number for the lawyer representing my father. "This is Captain Green," I said when the receptionist answered. "Tell your client we accept his invitation for lunch tomorrow, and tell him to bring his checkbook. We have some numbers to discuss." I hung up before she could answer. The investigation phase was over. The execution phase was about to begin. The invitation came via email from my father's lawyer at 9 a.m. the next morning. It was labeled Settlement Conference, but the venue wasn't a law office. It was the Capitol Grill. For those who don't know, the Capitol Grill is where the city's power players go to eat. It's a place of mahogany paneling, white tablecloths, and dry-aged steaks that cost more than my mother's weekly grocery budget. "I don't want to go, Heidi," Mom said, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. "I don't fit in there. Look at my shoes. They're scuffed." "We aren't going there to eat, Mom," I told her, my voice steel. "We are going there so you can see exactly who he has become. We need to look the devil in the eye one last time." When we walked into the restaurant, the air was thick with the smell of rich leather, expensive red wine, and seared beef. It was the scent of money. The hostess looked at my mother's worn wool coat with a flicker of judgment before leading us to a private booth in the back. My father and Tiffany were already seated. They looked like royalty holding court. A bottle of Silver Oak Cabernet Sauvignon, retail price about $200, sat open on the table, already half empty. Tiffany was wearing a low-cut dress that was far too revealing for a lunch meeting, her neck dripping in gold jewelry. She was laughing loudly at something my father said, her hand resting possessively on his forearm. The moment we arrived at the table, the laughter stopped. My father didn't stand up. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't even gesture for us to sit. He just jerked his chin toward the empty chairs opposite him, as if he were granting permission to beggars to rest their legs. "Sit," he grunted. I pulled out a chair for Mom. She sat down, keeping her coat on, looking small and terrified against the plush leather booth. My father was in the middle of eating bone-in ribeye. He picked up his steak knife and sawed into the meat. It was cooked rare. I watched the red juice pool on the white porcelain plate, mixing with the dark steak sauce. "Let's cut the crap and get straight to the point," Bob said, shoving a piece of meat into his mouth. He chewed slowly, staring at Mom with open contempt. "I don't have time to play games in court with your little toy soldier daughter. I have a business to run, so here is the final offer." He reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a personal check. He didn't hand it to Mom. He slapped it onto the table and slid it across the tablecloth with his finger like he was tipping a waitress. I looked at the number. $20,000. $20,000. That was his price for 32 years of marriage. That was his valuation of the woman who had birthed his child, cooked his meals, and nursed his ego when he was a nobody. "Take that money," he said, pointing at the check with his knife. "Buy yourself some new clothes, maybe fix your teeth. Go take a cruise or something, and then get the hell out of my life. Stop listening to Heidi. She's just trying to make a name for herself. You're old, Martha. Don't try to fight for things you didn't earn. You should be grateful I'm giving you anything at all." My blood ran cold. The Rolex Submariner on his wrist cost more than the check lying on the table. Mom stared at the piece of paper. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked like she had been slapped. Then Tiffany decided to speak. She swirled her wine glass, looking at the crimson liquid, a bored expression on her heavily made-up face. "Honestly, Martha," she drawled, her voice high and grating, "you should really just take it. Bob is being way too generous. I mean, look at you. You're tired. You're past your prime." She took a sip of wine, her eyes flashing with malice. "You haven't contributed a dime to his success in years. You've just been living off him like a parasite, a leech. What do you even need more money for? At your age, are you saving up for a coffin? Because frankly, that check is enough to bury you comfortably." The table went silent. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to drop away. Did she just ask my mother if she was saving for a coffin? Bob chuckled. It was a low, nasty sound. He found it funny. He was smiling at his mistress, proud of her cruelty. That was the breaking point. Mom let out a sob, a ragged, choked sound of pure humiliation. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. I didn't think. I reacted. I stood up so fast my heavy oak chair toppled backward and crashed onto the floor with a deafening boom. Every head in the restaurant turned toward us. I grabbed the glass of ice water sitting in front of me. In one fluid motion, I threw the contents straight into Tiffany's face. The water splashed across her expensive blowout, soaking her dress. The ice cubes hit her chest. Her mascara instantly began to run, turning her face into a smeared, black mess. She shrieked, jumping up and knocking over the $200 bottle of wine. "You crazy bitch!" she screamed. "Shut your mouth!" I roared. My voice wasn't the voice of a lawyer. It was the voice of a captain on a drill field. It commanded absolute silence. Tiffany froze, her mouth hanging open, water dripping from her chin. I leaned across the table. I placed my hands flat on the white tablecloth, right next to the bloody steak plate, and lowered my face until I was inches away from my father's nose. The smell of his cologne mixed with the smell of fear. Yes, for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. I lowered my voice to a whisper, a terrified, lethal whisper that is far scarier than shouting. $20,000, I hissed. You think my mother is that cheap? You think you can buy 30 years of loyalty with the spare change in your pocket? Bob tried to lean back, but he was trapped in the booth. "Now, Heidi, calm down." "You listen to me, Bob." I cut him off, my eyes boring into his soul. "You are going to pay for every single tear she shed today. And you aren't going to pay with money. You're going to pay with everything. Your reputation, your company, your freedom. I promised you a war, but you just signed a suicide note." I picked up the check. I held it up so he could see it clearly. I ripped it in half, then in quarters. I dropped the confetti-like pieces onto his half-eaten steak. "Enjoy your lunch," I said. "And save your appetite, because I'll see you in hell." I turned to Mom. "Come on, Mom, we're leaving. This place stinks of trash." I helped my mother up. She was still crying, but she held my arm tightly. We walked out of the Capitol Grill with our heads held high, leaving Tiffany screaming at the waitstaff for a towel and my father sitting in stunned silence, staring at the torn pieces of paper melting into his meat sauce. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a victorious rush. But as we stepped out into the cool afternoon air, I didn't know that the stress of that lunch had already done irreversible damage. I didn't know that the war I had just declared was about to take a casualty before the sun even went down. The drive home from the Capitol Grill was silent. My mother stared out the passenger window of the taxi, her face pale, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline of the confrontation. I thought the worst was over. I thought the humiliation was the weapon. I was wrong. The humiliation was just the distraction. The real weapon was much quieter and far more deadly. We got back to the apartment around 8 p.m. Mom said she felt tired. She complained of a dull ache in her left arm and a tightness in her jaw, but she dismissed it as stress. "I just need to sleep, Heidi," she said, shuffling toward her bedroom. "That lunch, it took everything out of me." 10 minutes later, I heard a crash. I ran into the hallway. Mom was on the floor, clutching her chest, gasping for air like a fish out of water. Her skin had turned a terrifying shade of gray. "Mom!" I screamed, sliding across the floor to her side. Chest, elephant, sitting on. She wheezed, her eyes wide with primal terror. I didn't panic. Panic gets people killed. My army training kicked in instantly. I pulled my phone out and dialed 911. Emergency, what is your location? 3442 Oak Street, apartment 4B, 58-year-old female, suspected cardiac arrest. I am starting CPR. I put the phone on speaker and positioned my hands over her sternum. Stayin' alive. That's the rhythm they teach you. Push hard, push fast. I pumped her chest, counting out loud, ignoring the sickening crunch of cartilage. Come on, Mom. Stay with me. Don't you dare leave me. Not like this. The sirens cut through the night air, getting louder and louder until they drowned out my own counting. Then came the heavy footsteps of the paramedics, the static of radios, the chaotic flash of red and blue lights bouncing off the cheap apartment walls. They loaded her onto the gurney, hooked her up to monitors that beeped frantically, and rushed her out. I jumped into the back of the ambulance, holding her hand. It was ice cold. Hold on, Martha, I whispered, pressing her hand against my cheek. We're going to be okay. We arrived at County General Hospital. The emergency room was chaos, a whirlwind of shouting doctors, beeping machines, and the sharp chemical smell of antiseptic that sticks to the back of your throat. They wheeled Mom behind the double doors of the trauma unit. I was stopped by a nurse. Ma'am, you have to stay here. Go to the registration desk. I stood there for a second, watching the doors swing shut, swallowing the urge to fight my way in. I took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and walked over to the triage desk. The administration lady looked tired. She typed my mother's name into the computer system. Green Martha, date of birth, June 12, 1966. Okay. She stared at the screen. She frowned. She typed something else, hit enter, and frowned deeper. She looked up at me, her expression shifting from bored to sympathetic. Ms. Green, I'm sorry to tell you this, but the system is flagging her insurance as inactive. That's impossible, I said, my voice shaking. She's covered under my father's policy, Blue Cross Blue Shield. It's a platinum plan. I see the policy number here, the woman said, turning the monitor slightly so I couldn't see the details. But it shows a status change. The primary policyholder, Robert Green, removed her as a dependent effective today. I felt the blood drain from my face. What time? She clicked a tab. The timestamp on the cancellation is 5:02 p.m. My knees almost gave out. I had to grab the counter to steady myself. 5:02 p.m. That was exactly 20 minutes after we walked out of the restaurant. He didn't just get angry. He didn't just go home and drink. He pulled out his phone, called his broker, and executed a kill order. He knew Mom had a history of high blood pressure. He knew the stress of a divorce could trigger a health crisis. And he deliberately, surgically, cut her lifeline. In America, the emergency room is required to stabilize you, yes. But the treatment for a heart attack, the catheterization lab, the stents, the days in the ICU, the medication, that costs tens of thousands of dollars. Without insurance, a single night in the hospital is enough to bankrupt a normal person. My father had just signed a financial death warrant for my mother while she was fighting for her actual life. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen was cracked from when I dropped it during CPR. The name on the notification read, Bob Green. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely unlock the screen. I opened the message. See, Heidi, this is the real world. Without me, your mother is a zero. I heard the ambulance. Good luck with the hospital bills. If you withdraw the lawsuit by tomorrow morning, I might consider reinstating her coverage. This is a lesson about real power. I stared at the words. The cruelty was so absolute, so calculated, it didn't feel human. He wasn't a father. He wasn't a husband. He was a terrorist. He was holding my mother's beating heart hostage to save his bank account. I looked up. Through the glass partition of the waiting room, I could see the doctors working on Mom. They were intubating her. A tube was going down her throat to breathe for her. She looked so small, so fragile. If you are listening to this and your blood is boiling right now, If you believe that using a sick woman's life as leverage is the act of a monster, please hit that like button. Leave a comment saying, "No mercy," if you think I should take him down. I need to know you've got my back. I gripped my phone. I squeezed it until my knuckles turned white, until the glass screen protector splintered under the pressure of my thumb. Tears dried up instantly. The fear I felt in the ambulance evaporated. In its place, a cold, dark fire ignited in the center of my chest. It was the same feeling I had before a combat patrol. Focus, clarity, lethality. I thought about the soldier's creed. We recited it every morning in basic training until it was burned into our DNA. I will always place the mission first. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. My mother was my fallen comrade. She had taken bullets for me her whole life. She had starved so I could eat. And now, she was lying on that table because of enemy fire. "Okay, Bob," I whispered to the empty waiting room, my voice sounding like gravel. "You want to play God? You want to decide who lives and who dies based on a signature." I looked at the text message one last time before taking a screenshot. "You wanted a war," I said, my reflection in the glass looking back at me with eyes that were no longer the eyes of a daughter, but the eyes of a soldier. "I'm going to bring the war to your front door, and this time, there will be no prisoners." I put the phone away. I didn't reply. You don't negotiate with terrorists, you eliminate them. The sun hadn't even fully risen the next morning when I pulled my Jeep Wrangler into the lot of the largest used car dealership in the county. This Jeep wasn't just a vehicle to me. It was the first thing I bought with my own paychecks after graduating from officer candidate school. It was my symbol of independence. It had mud on the tires from trails in 3 different states and a dent in the bumper from a fun weekend in the Appalachians. It was the one place I could go to escape the noise of the world. But right now, it was just an asset, a liquidity event. The salesman, a guy in a cheap polyester shirt who smelled like cigarettes and desperation, walked around the car, kicking the tires. He knew I was in a hurry. He could smell the urgency on me. "It's a nice rig," he said, scratching his chin. "But the market is soft right now. Best I can do is $12,000. Cashier's check today." It was a lowball offer. It was insulting. The Jeep was worth at least $18,000. But I didn't have time to haggle. I didn't have time to post it on Craigslist and wait for buyers. My mother was lying in a hospital bed with a billing department breathing down her neck, demanding a good faith deposit to continue her care. "Do it," I said, my voice flat. "Cut the check." I signed the title over without a tremor in my hand. As I watched a porter drive my Jeep away toward the detailing bay, I felt a sharp pang in my chest, a sense of loss. But I pushed it down. Assets can be replaced. Mothers cannot. I took the bus back to the hospital. It was crowded, smelling of wet wool and body odor. I sat in the back, clutching the cashier's check in my pocket, and pulled out my phone. I opened Facebook. I don't know why. Maybe I was looking for pain. Maybe I was looking for fuel. And there it was. A new post from Robert Greene, time-stamped 2 hours ago. The photo showed him standing on a manicured green lawn, a golf club in hand, with palm trees and the sparkling ocean in the background. He was wearing a white polo shirt and a visor, grinning that wide salesman grin. Checked in. The Breakers, Palm Beach, Florida. Caption: Living the good life, staying away from negative energy and toxic people. Blessed. He was playing golf. While his ex-wife lay in a cardiac ward, hooked up to machines because he cut her insurance, he was down in Florida, hitting balls and drinking Arnold Palmers. He was talking about negative energy while actively destroying lives. I stared at his smiling face until the screen blurred. "Enjoy the sunshine, Bob," I whispered to the phone, "because a storm is coming." I didn't fight this battle alone. The moment I got back to the hospital, I activated my network. First, I called Gary. Gary was a former Army intelligence officer I had served with. He was now a private investigator who specialized in digital forensics. I had helped him out of a legal jam with the VA a few years back, and he owed me. "Gary, it's Heidi. I'm cashing in the favor." "Name it, Cap," his gravelly voice answered instantly. I need eyes on the Caymans. I have a paper trail leading to Blue Ocean Holdings. I need to know who the signatories are. I need photos. I need proof that links the money to a person, not just a shell company. Consider it done, Gary said. I've got a contact in Georgetown. I'll dig up the dirt. I got your six, Heidi. I got your six. It's military shorthand for, I've got your back. It was the first time in days I felt safe, but the real nuclear weapon arrived an hour later. My phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Is this Heidi Green? The voice was female, older, and trembling with nerves. Speaking. Heidi, this is Barbara Wilson. I don't know if you remember me. I used to be the head bookkeeper for your father's company. Before he let me go. I sat up straight in the uncomfortable hospital chair. I remember you, Mrs. Wilson. You gave me cookies when I visited the office as a kid. I saw the news, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I saw the court docket online. I know what he's doing to your mother. It's not right. It's just not right. She paused, taking a ragged breath. He fired me 2 years ago because I refused to cook the books. He thought I was just a stupid old lady who would go quietly. But Heidi? I kept a backup. I have the shadow ledgers, the real ones. Not the ones he shows the IRS. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. This wasn't just a witness. This was a smoking gun. This was a direct hit. Mrs. Wilson, I said, my voice steady and intense, can you bring them to me, today? I'm on my way. For the next 48 hours, room 304 of County General Hospital became my war room. My mother drifted in and out of sleep, the rhythmic beeping of her heart monitor providing the soundtrack to our operation. Mrs. Wilson arrived with a heavy tote bag filled with hard drives and binders. We worked like a tactical operations center. We taped spreadsheets to the walls of the hospital room. We cross-referenced the bank transfer data I'd subpoenaed with Mrs. Wilson's internal ledgers. The picture that emerged was staggering. It wasn't just hiding assets. It was federal tax evasion on a massive scale. He was laundering money through phantom real estate projects that never broke ground. He was paying consulting fees to companies that didn't exist. He was embezzling funds from the company to pay for Tiffany's lifestyle, classifying diamond necklaces as office supplies. Every page we turned was another nail in his legal coffin. I stopped looking at him as my father. He was a target. He was a hostile entity that had engaged in financial terrorism. I drafted my closing arguments. I practiced my cross-examination questions in the bathroom mirror while nurses changed my mother's IV fluids. I prepared for every lie, every deflection, every excuse he might use. I wasn't preparing for a trial. I was preparing for a public execution. On the night before the final hearing, the hospital room was quiet. I sat by the window, polishing the brass buttons on my Army service uniform. Mom stirred. She opened her eyes, looking at me with deep, sunken sockets. She looked so tired, but the fear was gone. Heidi, she rasped. You don't have to do this. I'm scared, honey. He's powerful. He knows people. I don't want him to ruin your career. I put down the polishing cloth. I walked over and took her hand. It was warmer now. Mom, I said gently, he doesn't have power. He has money. There is a difference. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, you aren't going to bow your head to him ever again. We are going to take back everything. Not just the money. We are taking back your honor. She squeezed my hand weakly and closed her eyes, trusting me. I stood up and went to the small closet in the corner of the room. I took out my Class A uniform, the dark blue jacket, the crisp white shirt, the gold stripes on the sleeves. I put it on slowly, deliberately. I fastened every button. I adjusted my tie. I pinned my rack of ribbons to my chest. Medals earned for service, for excellence, for doing the hard things when no one was watching. I stepped in front of the full-length mirror on the back of the bathroom door. The woman looking back at me wasn't the useless tin soldier my father mocked. She wasn't the little girl who was rejected for not being a boy. She was Lady Justice. She held a sword in one hand and a scale in the other. And she was ready to bring the hammer down. I smoothed the fabric over my shoulders. I checked my watch. 06 hours. Time to go hunting, I whispered to the reflection. I grabbed the thick file containing Mrs. Wilson's ledgers and the photos Gary had just emailed me from the Caymans. I walked out of the hospital room, leaving my mother sleeping safely, and marched toward the elevators. The click of my polished shoes on the linoleum floor sounded like the ticking of a clock. My father's time had just run out. Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Harrison presiding. The bailiff's voice boomed, signaling the beginning of the end. I watched my father walk to the witness stand. He didn't walk like a man facing judgment. He walked like he was strolling onto a yacht. He adjusted his silk tie, smoothed the lapels of his Armani suit, and shot a confident wink at Tiffany in the front row. She giggled, flashing a thumbs up. They thought they had already won. His lawyer, a slick man named Mr. Sterling, whose smile looked like it was bought at a discount dealership, had just finished a 40-minute presentation. It was a boring, pitiful sob story about how green construction was suffering from market volatility, claiming my father was barely scraping by and had zero liquid assets to split with my mother. It was a good performance, but now it was my turn. Your witness, Captain Green, the judge said, looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. I stood up. I didn't bring a stack of papers. I brought a single thin sheet of yellow legal pad paper. I walked to the podium, placing my hands on the wood. Mr. Green, I began, my voice deceptively soft. You have just sworn under oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Is that correct? I did, Bob said, leaning back comfortably in the chair. And you have stated to this court, under penalty of perjury, that the financial affidavit you submitted, listing your total assets at less than $100,000, is accurate and complete? Bob smiled, that condescending smirk that used to make me feel small. That is correct. The economy has been tough, sweetheart. I'm a law-abiding citizen. I've declared everything I own. Click. The trap was set. He had just committed perjury on public record. I see, I said, stepping away from the podium. I started to pace slowly in front of the witness stand, like a shark circling a swimmer who doesn't know there is blood in the water. Then how do you explain your travel schedule, Mr. Green? According to your company credit card statements, you have visited Miami, Florida, 12 times in the last 18 months. Bob shrugged. I have business partners in Miami. Networking. It's part of the job. Networking, I repeated. And these trips? They were fully paid for by the company? First-class flights? 5-star hotels? Of course. You have to spend money to make money. I stopped pacing. I looked at my mother, who was sitting at the defense table in her old coat. So, while you were spending money to make money in Miami, are you aware that your wife was using coupons to buy expired bread at the grocery store because you limited her allowance to $50 a week? Bob sighed, rolling his eyes theatrically for the benefit of the judge. That's business, Heidi. You've been in the army too long. You don't understand how the corporate world works. It's complicated. The courtroom murmured. Even the court stenographer looked up, disgusted by his tone. Judge Harrison's brow furrowed. He didn't like being talked down to, and he certainly didn't like witnesses insulting military officers in his courtroom. You're right, Mr. Green, I said, my voice hardening. I might not understand business the way you do. I walked back to my table. I picked up the heavy black binder, the one containing the work of Mrs. Wilson and Gary. It was 3 inches thick. I turned back to him. I lifted the binder high in the air, letting the overhead lights catch the plastic cover. Then, I slammed it down onto the witness stand railing. Thud! The sound was explosive. It echoed off the high ceilings like a gunshot. Bob jumped in his seat. Tiffany gasped. But I do understand financial crimes, I roared. Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit A. I ripped the Velcro tab open and pulled out a stack of enlarged documents. This, I held up the first page, is a bank statement from the Cayman National Bank in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. It is for an account held by a shell corporation named Blue Ocean Holdings. Bob's face went from flushed to chalk white in a nanosecond. The arrogant smile simply dissolved. And this, I held up the second page, is the incorporation document for Blue Ocean Holdings. Mr. Green, do you recognize the signature at the bottom? I didn't wait for him to answer. I turned to the judge. The signature is dated May 14th, exactly 2 days before Mr. Green filed for divorce. And on that same day, a wire transfer of $2.5 million was made into this account. The courtroom erupted. Reporters in the back row started typing furiously on their laptops. Objection! Mr. Sterling jumped up, knocking over his water glass. This is ambush. We haven't seen these documents. Sit down, counselor, Judge Harrison barked, slamming his gavel. Overruled. Continue, Captain. I leaned into the microphone, my eyes locked on my father's terrified face. Where did that $2.5 million come from, Bob? Did it come from networking? Or did it come from the joint 401k retirement fund that you liquidated without your wife's consent by forging her signature? Bob started to sweat, profusely. The expensive makeup he wore for the cameras began to streak down his forehead. He looked around the room, searching for an exit, searching for a lifeline. He looked at Tiffany, but she was slowly backing away, her hand over her mouth, looking at him like he was a stranger. It's a misunderstanding, Bob stammered. His voice was high and weak. I was moving funds for tax optimization. You intended to steal. I cut him off. My voice filled the room, cold and sharp as a bayonet. You didn't just hide money, Bob. You committed federal tax evasion. You committed wire fraud. You committed perjury 5 minutes ago when you sat in that chair and lied to this court. I took a step closer, violating his personal space, looming over him. And the worst part? The part that makes you a monster, not just a criminal. Yesterday at 5:02 p.m., you canceled my mother's health insurance while she was in cardiac arrest. You tried to kill her with a spreadsheet because she dared to ask for her fair share. I didn't. Bob was shaking now. He looked small. He looked pathetic. Is that true? Judge Harrison asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of impending doom. He looked at Bob over his glasses. Did you cancel the defendant's medical coverage during a medical emergency? Bob opened his mouth, but no words came out. He slumped in the chair, defeated. I have the termination notice right here as Exhibit B, I said, placing the paper gently on the judge's bench. Along with a text message from the plaintiff mocking us for it. Judge Harrison read the text message. His face turned a deep shade of crimson. He slowly closed the file. He took a deep breath and looked at the bailiff standing by the door. I have heard enough, the judge said. This court finds that there is probable cause to believe the plaintiff has committed multiple felonies, including perjury and dissipation of marital assets. I am also referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation into insurance fraud and tax evasion. He banged the gavel. It sounded like a judgment from God. Mr. Green, your bail is revoked. You are remanded into custody immediately. Marshals, take him. 2 U.S. Marshals in tactical vests stepped forward. They didn't ask him to stand. They grabbed him by the arms and hauled him up. Bob looked at me, his eyes wide with shock. Heidi, please, I'm your father. I stood at attention, my face a mask of stone. You're not my father, I said, my voice steady. You're the defendant. The marshal spun him around. He pulled Bob's arms behind his back. Click, click. The sound of the handcuffs ratchet-locking around his wrists was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of the spell breaking. It was the sound of justice. No, you can't do this. I'm Robert Green. I built this town, he screamed as they dragged him toward the side door leading to the holding cells. I turned around to face the gallery. Tiffany was gone. She had bolted out the back door the moment the handcuffs came out. My mother was sitting there, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. I walked over to her. I didn't say a word. I just saluted her. The war was over. We had won. The moment the handcuffs clicked onto my father's wrists, the illusion of power that held his world together shattered instantly. And just like rats fleeing a sinking ship, the first one to jump overboard was the one who had claimed to love him the most. Tiffany didn't run to the rail to comfort him. She didn't cry out in anguish for her beloved fiancé. Instead, she spun around and grabbed Mr. Sterling, the expensive defense lawyer, by the lapels of his suit jacket. "What does asset forfeiture mean?" she shrieked, her voice shrill and panicked. "What about my allowance? What about the townhouse on 5th Street? The deed is in my name." Mr. Sterling peeled her hands off his suit, looking at her with undisguised annoyance. "Ms. Miller, please." The townhouse was purchased with funds that are now subject to a federal investigation. Everything is frozen. The house, the cars, the accounts. It's all gone until the audit is complete. The color drained from Tiffany's face. She looked at the lawyer, then turned her gaze to my father, who was currently being patted down by the U.S. Marshals. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The ATM had just been unplugged. The golden ticket had been canceled. She stomped over to where the marshals were holding Bob. She didn't look sad. She looked furious. "You useless old fool," she screamed, pointing a manicured finger in his face. "You told me you had it handled. You told me you were untouchable. You lied to me." "Tiffany, baby, please," Bob pleaded, his voice cracking. "I can fix this. I just need—" "You can't fix anything," she yelled. "I wasted 2 years of my prime on you. I gave up modeling gigs for this, for a broke felon." She grabbed her left hand with her right. She yanked the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger. She didn't hand it to him. She threw it. The ring hit Bob square in the chest, bouncing off his Armani lapel and skittering across the wooden floor of the courtroom. "I hope you rot," she spat. Then, without a backward glance, she turned and ran. The sound of her high heels clicking frantically against the floorboards faded as she burst through the rear doors, running away from the man she had promised to marry, running away from the wreckage, desperate to find a new host before her own bills came due. My father watched the door swing shut. His shoulders slumped. The devastation on his face wasn't just about the arrest. It was the crushing realization that his entire life, his love, his status, his pride, had been nothing more than a transaction. I turned my attention to the person who actually mattered. "Come on, Mom," I said softly. I helped my mother stand up. She was crying, but these weren't the tears of humiliation she had shed at the restaurant yesterday. These were tears of release. The tension that had held her body rigid for decades was finally leaving her muscles. We stood there as the marshals began to lead my father out. They had to walk him right past our table to get to the holding cells. The procession slowed down as they neared us. Bob stopped. The marshal gave him a nudge to keep moving, but Bob planted his feet. He looked at Mom. Then, he looked at me. For the first time in my life, I didn't see the giant who built skyscrapers. I didn't see the tyrant who controlled the household with a checkbook. I saw a small graying man in a wrinkled suit, hands bound behind his back, terrified of what lay ahead. He looked old. "Heidi," he whispered. His voice was trembling. I didn't think you could do it. I didn't think you had it in you." I looked at him. I felt a strange emotion welling up in my chest. It wasn't hate. I had burned through all my hate in the last 48 hours. It was pity. I reached up and adjusted the brim of my service cap, ensuring it was perfectly straight. I looked him in the eye, not as a daughter seeking approval, but as an officer addressing a defeated adversary. "That was your mistake," I said calmly. "You underestimated the women of the Green family. You thought we were weak because we were kind. You forgot that kindness isn't a lack of spine." I can make this right," he stammered, desperation creeping in. "Heidi, tell them, I'm your dad." I shook my head slowly. "My father died a long time ago, the day he chose money over his family," I said. "You're just a defendant now. Goodbye, Robert." I used his first name. It severed the last thread connecting us. His eyes widened as the weight of that rejection landed. The marshal grabbed his arm. "Let's go, Mr. Green." They dragged him away. I watched until the heavy metal door clicked shut behind them, sealing him into the darkness he had created for himself. "Let's get out of here," I said to Mom. We walked down the long center aisle of the courtroom. I pushed open the double doors and we stepped out onto the front steps of the courthouse. The afternoon sun hit us instantly, warm and bright. The air smelled of rain on hot asphalt, the scent of a summer storm that had finally passed. Above us, the American flag on the courthouse pole snapped in the breeze, the red, white, and blue vibrant against the sky. Mom stopped. She closed her eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. She filled her lungs completely, as if she were breathing for the first time in 32 years. "It's over," she whispered. "It's over, Mom," I said. She turned and hugged me. It wasn't a gentle hug, it was a desperate, bone-crushing embrace. She buried her face in the shoulder of my uniform and sobbed. "Thank you, Heidi. You saved my life. You really saved my life." I held her tight, staring out at the parking lot. I stroked her hair. "I've got you, Mom. I've always got you." We had won. Mom would get half of the true assets, the ones we uncovered. She would be secure, she would be safe. But as I stood there, I felt a hollow ache in the center of my chest. There is no joy in sending your own father to prison. There is no celebration in destroying your family tree, even if the roots are rotten. Justice had been served, but justice is a bitter medicine. It tastes like blood and regret. It was necessary, absolutely necessary. But it left a scar that I knew I would carry for the rest of my life. "Captain Green! Captain Green!" A voice called out from the bottom of the steps. It was Mr. Sterling, Bob's lawyer. He was jogging toward us, sweating, his tie loosened. "Wait up!" he panted. "Look, my client, he's willing to talk. Maybe we can cut a deal before the district attorney gets involved. If you drop the fraud charges, he can sign over the Florida property immediately. Let's not be hasty, right? It's family." I let go of Mom and stepped in front of her. I looked down the stairs at the man who, just yesterday, had sat eating steak while my mother was humiliated. "Family?" I repeated, my voice ice cold. "Yesterday, you watched him throw a check at my mother like she was a beggar. You didn't talk about family then." "That was just strategy," Sterling stammered. "Save your strategy for criminal court, counselor," I said. "You aren't negotiating with a daughter anymore. You're negotiating with the relentless machinery of the federal government. My evidence is already with the DA. There are no deals. There is only the law." I turned away from him, dismissing him completely. I looked at Mom. "Our ride is here." I waved down a yellow taxi that was idling at the curb. My Jeep was gone, sold to a stranger. Mom's Ford was dead in the driveway. We didn't own a car between us right now. But as I opened the taxi door for her, I felt richer than I had ever felt in my life. "Where to, ladies?" the cab driver asked as we slid into the back seat. Mom looked at me. "I don't know. Where do we go from here?" I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had felt on my face in days. "First," I said, leaning back against the seat, "we are going to a steakhouse, a nice one. And we are going to order the biggest steaks on the menu. And we are paying full price. No coupons, no sharing." Mom laughed, a wet, teary sound. "And then?" she asked. "And then," I said, taking her hand, "we're going to find you a new house, a place with a garden, a place that smells like flowers, not grease, a place filled with respect." "Driver," I said, "take us to downtown." The taxi pulled away from the curb, leaving the courthouse, the lawyer, and my father in the rearview mirror. We merged into traffic, moving forward, driving straight toward the rest of our lives. 6 months have passed since the gavel fell. I drove my rental car down a winding gravel road on the outskirts of town. The late afternoon sun filtered through the oak trees, casting dappled shadows on the dashboard. I wasn't driving toward a courthouse or a hospital today. I was driving toward peace. I pulled into the driveway of a small white clapboard cottage. It wasn't a mansion. It didn't have marble floors or a 3-car garage, but it had a wide, welcoming front porch and a garden that was exploding with color. Pink and yellow roses climbed the trellis by the front door. Hydrangeas bowed their heavy blue heads along the walkway. For 20 years, my father had forbidden Mom from planting a garden like this. He called it cluttered and country. He wanted manicured lawns that looked like golf courses. Now, the air smelled like sweet nectar and damp earth. It smelled like freedom. The screen door squeaked open, and my mother stepped out. I actually had to blink for a second. The woman standing on the porch didn't look like the terrified, gray-faced victim I had defended in court. She looked 10 years younger. She was wearing a bright yellow floral dress that hugged her frame, and her hair, usually pulled back in a severe knot, was loose and soft around her shoulders. "Heidi!" she called out, waving a gardening trowel. She hurried down the steps, moving with a lightness I hadn't seen since I was a child. She hugged me, smelling of sunscreen and lavender soap. "Look at you, Mom," I said, pulling back to admire her. "You're glowing." "I feel good, honey," she beamed. "I really do. The garden club ladies are coming over tomorrow, so I have to get these weeds pulled. And on Thursday, I'm going ballroom dancing at the community center. Can you believe it? My feet still remember the steps." She laughed, and it was a genuine, full-throated sound. She had found the Martha she used to be before the money and the misery buried her. We sat on the front porch in wicker rocking chairs, drinking tall glasses of iced tea with lemon wedges. The wind chimes tinkled softly in the breeze. It was the kind of quiet afternoon that money can't buy. "Have you heard any news?" I asked, watching the ice melt in my glass. Mom's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of calm acceptance. "I got a letter yesterday from the Federal Correctional Institution. My father had been sentenced to 5 years for tax evasion and wire fraud. The IRS had seized everything: the Porsche, the house, the accounts. Even the company name had been liquidated to pay off creditors. As for Tiffany, she had vanished before the ink on the arrest warrant was dry, rumored to be living in Miami with a car dealership owner twice her age. Mom reached into her pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope stamped with the prison's inspection seal. "He wrote to me," she said softly. I took the letter. The handwriting was shaky, stripped of its usual arrogant flourish. "Martha, I have a lot of time to think in here. I realize now that I was chasing a ghost. I thought money made me a man. I thought it made me invincible. But sitting in this cell, I realize I'm the poorest man on earth. I lost the only 2 people who ever actually loved me for me. I'm so sorry." I folded the letter and handed it back. "How does that make you feel?" Mom looked out at her rose bushes. She took a sip of tea. "It makes me feel sad for him," she said. "But I forgive him, Heidi." I looked at her, surprised. After everything he did? After the insurance? The insults? "I'm not forgiving him because he deserves it," she said, turning to look at me with eyes that were clear and strong. "I'm forgiving him because I deserve peace. Holding on to hate is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I'm done drinking poison. I have a life to live." I stared at her in awe. I had spent years training for war, learning how to destroy enemies. But my mother, with her soft hands and floral dress, had mastered the hardest battle of all, the battle for her own soul. I looked over at the chair where my Army service uniform was hanging on a hanger. My bags were packed in the car. "I leave tomorrow at 0600, I said. "My orders for Germany came through. I'll be stationed in Stuttgart for 3 years. "I know," Mom said, her eyes getting a little misty. "I'm going to miss you. But you have a job to do." I stood up and walked over to my uniform. I ran my fingers over the fabric. "You know, Mom," I said reflectively. "Growing up, Dad always told me that our legacy was the business. He said legacy was about buildings, concrete, and bank accounts. He thought that because I didn't want that, I was a failure." I turned back to her. "But he was wrong. He left a legacy of rubble and shame. But you started with nothing. You worked double shifts. You sacrificed. And you raised a daughter who knows right from wrong." I choked up, my throat tight. I used to be ashamed that we were poor. But today, I am prouder to be the daughter of a waitress than the daughter of a millionaire. Your resilience is my inheritance, Mom. That's the real legacy. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. The crickets started their evening chorus. It was time to go. I stood up and put on my cover, my uniform hat. I smoothed my shirt. Mom stood up too. She looked small next to me, but her spirit filled the entire porch. You be safe over there, Heidi, she whispered, cupping my face in her hands. You make them respect you. I will, I promised. And you keep dancing. I walked down the steps to the gravel driveway. I opened the car door, but before I got in, I turned around. Mom was standing on the porch, framed by the climbing roses, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a starter wife. She was a survivor. She was the queen of her own castle. I stood tall. I brought my heels together. I raised my right hand to the brim of my hat in a slow, crisp, ceremonial salute. It wasn't a salute for a superior officer. It was a salute for the bravest warrior I had ever known. Mom smiled, tears streaming down her face, and waved her hand. I smiled back, lowered my hand, and got into the car. I started the engine and backed out of the driveway. As I drove away, watching her figure get smaller in the rearview mirror until she disappeared around the bend, I didn't feel heavy anymore. The war was over. The home front was secure. I turned the car onto the main road, heading toward the airport, toward Germany, toward the future. Mission accomplished. Looking back at this journey, I realized that my father's biggest mistake wasn't the fraud. It was his definition of wealth. He believed power came from controlling others and hoarding assets. But watching my mother bloom in her 60s taught me the real truth. True power is the courage to walk away from what hurts you, no matter how scary the unknown might seem. It is never too late to rewrite your story. You are not defined by the scars of your past or the balance in your bank account. You are defined by your resilience. If you are holding onto a painful past, let this be your sign. You are strong enough to let go and plant your own garden. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to stand up to a family member to protect your peace or defend a loved one? It is the hardest battle to fight, but sometimes it is the most necessary one. If you enjoyed watching Justice Be Served today, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us share more stories of truth and triumph. And do me a favor, leave a comment below saying, "New beginning," if you believe that the best revenge is simply living a happy, healthy life. Until next time, stay strong and take care of each other.